involved in this, in Hispanic genealogy, back in, I guess it was around 2000. I formed the Rio Grande Valley SAR chapter. It started out in Brownsville and now is in Harlingen. As a matter of fact, we were down here a couple of weeks ago speaking to them. And I also formed the Laredo chapter. And the Laredo chapter was unique in that every member was not only Hispanic, but had an Hispanic name. But not one of them had a Hispanic revolutionary ancestor. All of them were descended from Patrick Henry, who moved, his grandson moved to the border, and he married a Mexican lady, and all the members of the Laredo chapter come from that union. And it was very easy doing their application because lo mismo, lo mismo, lo mismo. So anyhow, I got involved in recruiting. The applicants would say, well, can you help me with my Hispanic genealogy? And of course, the first person I looked at was Bernardo Galvez. By the way, you folks already knew how to pronounce his name. For all my life, I was pronouncing it Bernardo Galvez. But they don't call it Galvez town. It's Galveston. And his name was Galvez. The accent's on the first syllable. So I've been trying to teach people that didn't already know. There we go. This is the cover of my book. I'm with my executive assistant here.
There you go.
And does anybody recognize this fella with me? Well, he's now the King of Spain. This was in May of 2010, and at that time he was the Crown Prince. And I had an audience lined up with the King, but the King that day was in the hospital recovering from lung surgery, and he sent Crown Prince Felipe, who turned out to be delightful. One lady asked me, well, did he speak English? Did he have a strong American accent? He got a master's degree from Georgetown University in Washington. He had no accent. And not this picture, but there's a picture in my book where my wife was almost swooning when she met him. He's rakishly handsome, and he is a wonderful conversationalist. He put a dent in my chest. As we were standing there right after this meeting, I was presenting a medal to him for the Sons of the American Revolution. He kept saying, I want you to write a book about Spain's involvement in the American Revolutionary War. Then I want you to write a screenplay, and I want you to get Hollywood to make a movie, and I want Antonio Banderas to play the part of Galvez. I swear to God, that's what he said. So I've written the book, I've written the screenplay, I've talked with the agent. He's not interested in talking until the money's in place and the director's been appointed. But when Robin and I were out, we made a little book tour out in California in November. And we spoke at the World Affairs Council in San Diego. And there were some people there that were involved in the movie industry. So they've now formed a committee. It's called SPAR. Hispanic, I don't even remember what it stands for. But basically, they've got a fellow who wrote the first series that the History Channel presented on the American Revolution. And he's involved and is going to prepare a 6-part documentary first. And the thought is that once we get the documentary in place, the interest for raising the money for the movie should follow. So hopefully I'll be getting some movie royalties one of these days. I don't know, but my main objective is to spread the word. I had the pleasure of testifying before the Texas Education Association, which was an adjunct of the Texas legislature, about the textbooks in Texas. This was 4 or 5 years ago. And the only concession that they made was trying to get them to put Spain's involvement in history books. The only thing they did is say, okay, we're going to list Bernardo Galvez as approved outside reading. I guess we made a niche, but I understand they're going to go into session again, maybe next spring, and I'll certainly be there. So anyhow, let's talk about the book. Next slide, please. This is our hero, and he really is a hero of mine, And once you hear all of this, maybe he'll be a hero of yours also. Next slide. The purpose of this is to show most of the gringo audiences that Spain was actively exploring what is now the United States well before the Jamestown settlement in 1607 or the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth Rock in 1620, because this is back in the, well, this slide shows the 17th century, but we all know they were here in the early 16th century. Next slide. One of the biggest problems that Spain had with England was the Spanish Main. And the Spanish Main, we all know that Spain discovered gold in Mexico and silver in Mexico and also in Peru and other places in Latin America. And all of that was brought up to the Caribbean through the Isthmus of Panama or through Veracruz, Mexico. And then they would stop in Havana and reprovision and then on to Spain. Well, Britain established military bases all throughout the Caribbean basin for the primary purpose of attacking these treasure ships. The king appointed pirates as privateers, and he gave what was called a letter of marque. And what that said was you have the king's authority to seize Spanish ships and cargo, and you get to keep everything except the crown gets 15% of all the loot. And that's what's so important, because we're going to see that Galvez was in the process of removing those English bases. Next slide. Before 1763, France owned all of the property west of the Mississippi River. By the Treaty of 1763, which ended the French and Indian War, France lost. France lost all the property west of the Mississippi, which was given to Spain. And as a result, Spain started building fortresses along the west coast of the Mississippi River. They went as far north as St. Louis, where they had Fort San Carlos, and there was a satellite fort 30 miles down the river, St. Genevieve. And then they had one in Arkansas, at a place called Arkansas Pass, where the Arkansas River intersects with the Mississippi River. And then they had, of course, New Orleans. Now, next slide. Here's our not very handsome king, but in the history books, we're all led to believe that France was the big hero of the American Revolutionary War. Now, next slide. When this young fellow became king of France at age 16, King Carlos III had been on the throne for 38 years. So who was the senior member of this family? Who was calling the shots? Spain. But Spain was quiet about it because during all this time it was negotiating with Portugal about what would soon become Brazil. Of course, we know that the Pope settled that dispute by drawing a line. Everything east of the line goes to Portugal, everything west of the line goes to Spain. Next slide, please. So in 1761, these two kings entered the Bourbon family compact. And this was the fifth such compact between these two families. But basically, they agreed that if one country is at war, the other country will provide arms, ammunition, manpower, and support. Next slide. This is what we're talking about. Next slide, please. Okay. Did any of you know that Spain provided support to the colonists before July 4th, 1776? All the history books talk about the first support from a foreign government came after the Battle of Saratoga, and it came from France. Wrong. I said that loudly to put emphasis. Wrong. A ship arrived in New Orleans on September 1st, 1776. That ship was from Spain, and it was laden with cannon, arms, ammunition, medical supplies, tents, uniforms, and other military supplies. And I figured it out with how fast ships were traveling in those days from northern Spain because it came from Bilbao in the Basque region of Spain. And that ship had to have left before July 4th, 1776. The agreement to provide that support between the two kings was made around the first day of May of 1776. As I said, Spain remained quiet about this because they were negotiating. And it was so quiet that Spain and France set up a dummy corporation, Hortense and Company, in Paris, France. And that company was to be the conduit. France put in 1 million litres, Spain put in 1 million litres. And the guy who was managing it was a man named Beaumarchais. That name may ring a bell to you because he was the writer of the opera, The Barber of Seville, a very famous man during that time. So all that money was coming through this dummy corporation, and to this date, France still claims 100% of that money. We have an SAR chapter in France, and I'm going round and round constantly with them about my project. As a matter of fact, they voted and asked the president of SAR to ban my book. Really, I'm not kidding. So, point here is, before the Declaration of Independence was signed, our forefathers knew they were getting help from both Spain and France. And although I think that maybe takes a little bit away from the bravery of what they were doing because they were putting their lives and their fortunes at stake, I think they felt a lot better knowing that they had the two big. And the deal is, England had the largest navy in the world, but France and Spain combined had a much larger navy than England. Next slide. That's a handsome fellow. Next slide. Okay. Bernardo Galvez was appointed as the governor of Louisiana in 1776. And he arrived in New Orleans about the time that first cargo ship arrived on September the 1st. King Carlos told him before he left Spain that he should prepare for war with Spain. Now this is 3 years before Spain actually declared war. And again, this subterfuge was because of their negotiations with Portugal. Portugal was an ally of England. They didn't want to do anything to alienate Portugal and screw up their deal with South America because they ended up getting everything but Brazil. So when he got there, he took a survey and found that he was surrounded by British forts. Now the red bombast at the top represents Natchez, Mississippi, where there was an English fort. The next one down is Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where there was a big fort. Beneath that is a town called Manchac, Louisiana. Robert and I were tracing this history several years ago. We went to Manchac looking for a monument or a marker or something. And we were standing around looking at this doctor and his son around biking, and they came by and said, "Can we help you?" And I said, "Well, we're looking for some evidence to mark the battle site here in Manchac." He said, "Well, I've lived here for 18 years and I wasn't aware that there's been a battle fought here." So historians have not done their job in marking battlefields. So anyhow, to the New Orleans is where the yellow cross is, and to his east were British forts in Mobile, and the second largest British fort in the Western Hemisphere, Pensacola. The largest fort was in Kingston, Jamaica, which was, if any of you have read anything about pirates, you know that was where all the pirates and privateers, not all of them, but a large number of them were based. So he started recruiting a militia, and probably the easiest people that he recruited were those that we call Cajuns today, who came from Acadia. What had happened, the British fleet came into Acadia, told these settlers, these French settlers, they had to leave within 30 minutes, pack whatever they could carry. And so these people had their arms full of possessions, and they were on the British ships. And as they pulled out of the harbor, they were watching their homes burn to the ground. So there was no love lost between them and the British. And in the first battle, which was the Battle of Manchac, he left New Orleans with 700 soldiers. When he arrived at Manchac, he had over 1,400 soldiers. He had recruited mostly those, but also he had recruited Negroes, Indians. There were some Germans that were living in that part of the country at that time. And he had a United Nations in the attack. Next slide, please. This shows not only did he have those forts that I talked about, but down in Central America, you see that white, that was British Honduras. Over to the right of British Honduras is Jamaica. There were 3 major forts in Jamaica, including the largest in the Western Hemisphere. And then up, there were 3 forts on Nassau Island in the Bahamas. And then St. Augustine, Florida. Any of you been there and seen that beautiful fort? It's gorgeous. I've done a lot of research over the years, and I haven't been able to find any evidence that a single British soldier from St. Augustine ever left St. Augustine to go fight the Americans or to fight the Spanish. I don't know what the theory was, but they had several hundred soldiers that were battle tested, didn't use them to our benefit. Okay, next slide. All right, between 1776 and 1779, when Spain declared war, these figures that are here are not for me. They came out of the mouth of Benjamin Franklin. He was giving in a letter where he wrote to Galvez and credited the receipt of 215 bronze cannon, 30,000 muskets, etc. But the point is, the aid was substantial, and the aid was constant. There were constant ships landing in New Orleans, going up the Mississippi River, up the Ohio River to Fort Pitt, going to Washington's troops. Now, some of that was given to George Rogers Clark and his army at Louisville, which was then called Fort Nelson, right on the Ohio River. Next slide. Well, they finally declared war on May the 8th, 1779. And once they did, Galvez was ready to go. I mean, pretty much. So, as I said, next slide, he went up the river to the Battle of Manchac. And fortunately, the British didn't know that war had been declared by Spain. So they weren't ready for an attack. And it was an easy victory for Galvez. Well, after he's been arrested for a day or two, then they went further north up the Mississippi River. And you think about it, they're marching in the swamp with alligators and snakes and all kind of insects and bugs. It must have been fairly miserable. You see here 1,427 members. The men is what he had when he arrived. He left with 700 thereabouts. So the next battle was the Battle of Baton Rouge. And this is where he began to show what a tactician he was. He divided his army into half. Half he sent into a heavily wooded area that was behind the fort. The other half he kept concealed. He told the half that went into the woods, make as much noise as you can. Chop down as many trees as you can. Build fires, build 3 times as many fires as you actually need, because we want the British to think that we're all in the woods. While they were doing that, his troops, under concealment, were digging trenches and slowly advancing cannon toward the front of the fort. 2 days later, he had troops in the woods begin firing on the fortress from the rear. They were fired for so long that the British commander, in his wisdom, moved all the cannon from the front of the fort to the rear of the fort so he could meet the challenge. Whoops, sorry about that, because as soon as he did that, Galvez attacked the front gate, and within hours, the fort surrendered. Now, there's a lot of men involved, a lot of cannon involved, and cannon was not easy to come by in those days. It took months to get it from Europe. So, the British commander, was asked save bloodshed, you'll write a letter to the commanding officer of your fort in Natchez. Galvez sent 2 of his junior officers with the 2 senior officers of the British Army, and they all went up to Natchez, and Natchez laid down their arms without a shot being fired. So by this time, Galvez had removed the British as a threat on the lower Mississippi River. What he was thinking of, and what George Washington was thinking of, was we can't have a second front in this war. And the British wanted to create a second front from the west. So he gets back to New Orleans and starts planning. Got 2 more big forts to get rid of, Mobile and Pensacola. So when he gets his troops in place, he again divides his forces in half. By this time, next slide please. We already talked about it. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. By this time, he'd already seized 5 forts, 8 ships, which he got mostly off the Lake Pontchartrain. They were British raiders. A stockpile of weapons, gunpowder, and 1,000 prisoners. That was substantial back in those days. Well, anyhow, what he did is he divided his army in half. He sent half by land marching to attack Mobile from the rear. The other went with him in these newly captured ships that became Spanish ships down the Mississippi River into the Gulf, and they were going to attack Mobile from Mobile Bay. And they were joined by a flotilla of Spanish warships from Havana. So they had a pincer movement. They had 2 different groups from the ocean and 1 from behind. And back in those days, next slide, back in those days, I'm going to stop and tell you about this. I'm sorry, I shouldn't interrupt myself. This is a portrait of a very significant event. Spain had a small flotilla of ships sailing south of England. They intercepted a convoy of 63 British ships headed for Boston. 50-something of those ships had British troops to reinforce the redcoats in Boston. They had cannon, ammunition, arms, the whole gamut. Our small Spanish fleet captured 55 of those 63 ships during this battle. And 8 of them were Spanish warships, 8 of them were English warships, which became Spanish warships. And to this day, that is the largest single capture of enemy ships in the history of mankind. Pretty significant event. Just think for a minute, if all those soldiers on those 50-some-odd ships had arrived in Boston, the Battle of Boston might have been a lot different. George Washington's fate might have been substantially different. That to me is the largest significant event in the American Revolutionary War. Okay, now we're back to Mobile, and I'll just, now go to the next slide. Look how long it took. It took over a month, even with his wonderful planning. But there again, you know, we didn't have machine guns and we didn't have the kind of artillery that we have now. And so they killed a few here and they killed a few there. But finally, on 14th of March, 1780, he was successful. So then, the next event, Pensacola. It took a while, and he mustered most of the ships that he was going to use and the men in Havana. And from Havana, they left towards Pensacola, and 2 days out of Havana, no weather reports back in those days, they were hit by a hurricane. And that hurricane decimated his fleet. He lost about half his ships and half his men. And the London Times, 2 months later, stated that he lost over 2,000 soldiers and sailors. And that's probably a pretty accurate figure because he left with about 4,000. Next slide. All right, he went back to Havana. A lot of letter writing back and forth between him and the king. I haven't mentioned it because it's only such a small time, but both his father and his uncle were high officials in the Spanish government. His uncle was the viceroy of what is now Peru and Latin. They called it the viceroy of Peru, but it was for all of Latin, Central, and South America. And long story short, he was able to get more ships and more men in Havana. And he sits out from Havana. Next slide. Look at how many men he had under his command. 7,587 men. To put that in perspective, George Washington had 6,000 troops in the Continental Line, and General Cornwallis at Yorktown had about 6,000 troops. So this was a significant military force. Something happened that was really funny, and what I've done in my book, and there's a part of my book that reads like a novel, where I describe Admiral Solano, who was in charge of the Spanish fleet. Not very flattering. But Admiral Solano tried to take his flagship into Pensacola Bay, and he got grounded on the sandbar. He was a short-tempered guy, and he hoisted flags, and he says,